In the quiet of a North Carolina afternoon, a cream-colored envelope sat tucked inside Minnie's rusted mailbox after 3 long years of silence. But as her trembling hands reached out to open it, her husband's sharp shout to stop exposed a cruel reality. That familiar handwriting was actually a $15,000 trap. It makes you wonder if a mother's heart can stay strong enough to avoid a pitfall dug by her own son-in-law. Hi, I'm Casey. Ever felt time crawl while waiting for a loved one's call? For Minnie, 3 years of silence was salt in a wound. A letter finally arrived, but it wasn't a cure. It was a cruel lie aimed at a mother's heart. Let's go back to the house where it all began. Time in this small town crawls so slowly that I sometimes think I can hear the moss growing on the stone steps leading to our front porch. It has been 3 long years since that door slammed shut, and in many ways, my life stopped at that very second. I still go through the motions of living, I still breathe, but my heart feels like that ancient clock in the living room. It keeps ticking, but it never quite tells the right time anymore. This morning, I woke up as the first slivers of sunlight began to pierce through the heavy branches of the old oak tree in the yard. Ralph was still asleep beside me, his breathing heavy and rhythmic, the sound of a man who has grown old alongside his own quiet sorrows. I slipped out of bed and headed to the kitchen to brew a pot of hazelnut coffee. As the familiar scent filled the air, it pulled me right back to those Sunday mornings when Naomi was still here. I could almost see her standing there, helping me flip pancakes on the griddle, her voice bright as she talked about all her plans for the city. But that was 3 years ago. Now, the kitchen is filled only with a silence that feels heavy enough to crush a person. I have kept her room exactly the way she left it. Every doll is still on the shelf, and I cannot even bring myself to scrub away the tiny ink stain on the rug. People tell me I am crazy, that I should just let go. But they do not understand what it feels like for a mother to have her only child suddenly treat her like an enemy. I stepped out onto the porch, and the biting chill of the North Carolina morning made me shiver. Out of habit, I looked toward the wooden mailbox at the end of the driveway. It has become my daily ritual, a cycle of hope and disappointment that repeats with every sunrise. For 3 years, I have sent more cards and letters than I can count. All I ever got back were those cold return to sender stamps, or the deafening silence Ethan built around her. He took her away, whispering that I was a controlling woman, until she believed it. Ralph tells me to stop looking at that mailbox, because it only breaks my heart. But I cannot. Today is Naomi's 38th birthday. I already have an apple pie sitting on the counter, knowing we will likely eat it in tears. But as I touched the mailbox lid, my heart stopped. There, sitting all alone, was a cream-colored envelope. No postmark, just my name in a handwriting I thought I had forgotten. I stood there in the fading morning light of the Carolinas, the sun feeling thin and brittle against my skin. My fingers traced the words, "For Mom," on the outside of the envelope, the ink slightly smeared as if written in a hurry. The handwriting was slanted, still carrying those unique loops and curves that belonged only to Naomi. For over 1,000 days, I had played this moment over in my mind, practicing exactly what I would say, how I would pull her into my arms, and how I would offer every bit of forgiveness I had stored up. But holding it now, a cold shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the breeze. It was a familiar, haunting dread, the exact same feeling I had that terrible afternoon 3 years ago, when I first started losing my daughter to that man. It was a Thanksgiving day that should have been perfect. The house was filled with the warm, buttery scent of roasting turkey, and I could hear Ralph in the cellar clinking wine bottles as he chose something special for dinner. Naomi and Ethan had driven in from the city, looking like a picture from a high-end magazine. Ethan, with his bright sun-kissed smile and those expensive designer coats, always knew exactly how to charm everyone in this town. He was the golden son-in-law, the one who listened intently and laughed at all the right times. But when I went into the guest room to find some extra linens, I saw a folder peeking out of his laptop bag. It wasn't work for his IT firm. It was a stack of bank statements covered in bright red ink, alongside a pile of past due notices from casinos in Atlantic City. My heart didn't just sink. It felt like it stopped. My daughter, my sweet, naive girl, who thought she was living a fairy tale, was actually standing on the edge of a financial cliff without even knowing it. I decided to talk to her privately, hoping to protect her pride. I pulled her into the small kitchen, the same place where I had taught her to bake cornbread when she was just a little girl. I handed her those papers, my voice trembling as I told her that she needed to wake up, that Ethan was burning through their life savings at the card tables. I expected her to break down, to fall into my arms and ask for help. Instead, her eyes changed in a way I will never forget. They turned hard and hostile, looking at me with a coldness that felt like a physical blow. She told me I was doing it again, that I was trying to control her life and destroy anything she loved just because I hadn't been the one to choose it for her. Ethan walked in then, but he didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and put on the most pathetic, wounded expression I have ever seen. He told her, in that smooth, fake voice, that he had warned her I would never accept him, that I only wanted them to divorce so I could have her under my thumb again. That was the moment the door to her heart slammed shut. She didn't look at the evidence in her hands. She only looked at the man who was pulling her strings. They packed their bags that very night, leaving Ralph standing silent on the porch while I sobbed in the driveway. She told me never to find her again. For 3 years, every gift and every card I sent was intercepted by him and sent back with a cold stamp that felt like a slap in the face. This letter is the first thing to make it through that wall, and I find myself wondering if it is a lifeline or just the start of a brand new nightmare. I stood there, my fingers shaking so hard I nearly dropped the envelope onto the dew-covered grass. 3 years of silence, and now it was here, feeling as light as a feather, but as heavy as a mountain. I took a deep breath, catching the scent of fresh paper and a hint of wood that reminded me so much of her office back in the city. I tore the corner of the envelope open, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had spent 1,000 nights praying for an apology, or just a simple, "I miss you, Mom." But what stared back at me was a nightmare written in blue ink. "Mom, I am in big trouble," the letter read. "I have to have emergency gallbladder surgery, and the insurance won't cover all of it. Ethan says we are stuck for cash because of some investments. I need $15,000 right away, or they won't let me be discharged. Don't tell Dad. You know he will just yell at me. I have included a wallet code for the electronic transfer below. Please find someone to help you send it. I love you." My head started spinning. $15,000 was nearly every penny Ralph and I had saved up to replace the leaking roof next summer. But my Naomi, my little girl, was hurting somewhere out there. I stumbled back into the house, my hands fumbling for the phone on the kitchen counter as the world began to blur behind my tears. "Stop right there, Minnie. Let me see that." Ralph's voice was like a crack of thunder behind me. He had been standing there the whole time, his old reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He took the letter from my hands, his eyes narrowing with the focus of a man who spent 40 years as a railroad engineer. He did not even read the words at first. Instead, he scanned the entire page, then used his thumb to rub hard against the ink. "Minnie, look at this," he said, his voice dropping into a low, warning tone. "Naomi has always written the letter N with a tiny little loop at the top. It is a habit she has had since the 3rd grade. These letters are too flat, too forced. This is not Naomi." I shook my head, my heart fighting against my head. "But it is her name, Ralph. She is in danger." "The only danger here is to our savings," Ralph said, pointing at the long string of random characters at the bottom. "Naomi works in tech. She knows we do not know the first thing about digital currency. Why would a girl in physical agony ask her mother to navigate a complex computer transfer instead of just picking up the phone? Minnie, wake up. Whoever wrote this knows exactly how much you love her, and they are using that love to reach into your pocket." My heart breaks for Minnie. It's a mother's instinct versus Ralph's cold logic. If a plea came after 3 years, would you send the money or doubt it? Many are targeted through their love for family. Have you ever faced this? Share your story below. Now, let's see if Minnie heeds Ralph's warning. Ralph remained standing there, the forged letter still gripped in his hand, as if it were a piece of criminal evidence he was trying to decipher. His warning felt like a bucket of ice water being poured over my frantic heart, a cold splash of reality that I simply wasn't ready to accept. "Do not go, Minnie. It is a trap," he had said, his voice thick with a kind of heavy worry I had rarely heard in all our years of marriage. But in my mind, that forged handwriting wasn't just a trick about money anymore. It had transformed into a desperate cry for help, a muffled scream coming from a psychological dungeon I could barely imagine. If Ethan had actually dared to mimic his wife's handwriting just to get his hands on our savings, then what on earth was he doing to her? What was her life really like behind those closed doors? I couldn't sit in that kitchen a second longer, surrounded by the peaceful scent of hazelnut coffee, while my daughter was trapped in a nightmare. I grabbed the keys to our old Buick from the hook by the door. Ralph reached out to catch my hand, trying to pull me back into the safety of his logic. But I pulled away with a sudden strength that surprised even me. "Ralph, you can stay here with your calculations and your proof, but I am her mother," I told him. "If I don't go there today, if I don't see her with my own eyes, I will regret it until the day I die." I walked out into the yard, the gravel crunching under my feet with a sharp, dry sound that mirrored the tension in my chest. As I drove through the familiar streets of our small town, past the ancient oak trees that were just beginning to drop their golden leaves, the peaceful North Carolina morning felt like a cruel joke. Everything looked so calm, so normal, while I was racing toward the city, toward the glitzy high-rise prison that my daughter called a home. The closer I got to Naomi's upscale apartment complex, the tighter my hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles were white. This was a neighborhood for the young and the successful, a place where everything was polished, sleek, and utterly cold. I pulled the car over in front of the security gate, my heart pounding so hard against my ribs that it actually started to ache. I had brought that cream-colored envelope with me, clutching it like a ticket that would finally grant me entry into the life I had been barred from for 3 long years. I pressed the buzzer for apartment 402. I waited through one long ring, then another, the silence on the other end feeling like it might make me explode. Finally, Ethan's voice came through the intercom. It was still that smooth, buttery tone that used to charm me. But now, all I could hear was the calculated deception underneath it. "Mother Minnie? What are you doing here at this hour?" When the elevator doors finally slid open, Ethan was already standing there in the hallway, waiting for me. He was wearing a gray turtleneck sweater, looking as poised and elegant as if he had just stepped out of a fashion magazine. He offered me a half smile, the kind of smirk I had once mistaken for friendliness, but now recognized as a shield. "Naomi is resting, and you really shouldn't have come without calling first," he said, stepping forward to physically block the entrance to their home. I didn't take a single step back. I held that letter up right in front of his face, my voice hardening with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. "Put away the act, Ethan," I said. "Explain this to me right now. Why does Naomi need $15,000 sent through a digital wallet? And why is this handwriting so clearly not hers?" Ethan's expression didn't flicker, not even for a second. He maintained a terrifying level of calm. He let out a soft, weary sigh, his face shifting into an expression of dramatic pity. "Here we go again," he murmured. "What has Ralph been filling your head with this time? Naomi is very weak right now, and she doesn't want to see anyone, especially you. That letter was written while she was in intense pain. Of course her handwriting looks different. We are going through a difficult time, and you were the only person we thought we could turn to for help. And yet, here you are, coming to my home to interrogate me?" He stepped closer, using his height to try and shadow me, to make me feel small. "Do you realize that this behavior is exactly what pushes Naomi further away? She is going to be devastated when she hears that you doubted her safety just to save your money." I looked deep into his eyes, searching for a crack in the armor. For just a split second, I saw a flicker of hesitation, a cold calculation behind his pupils. He was trying to gaslight me, to turn me into the cliché of a meddling, senile old woman who is too paranoid for her own good. "Let me see my daughter," I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. Right then, Naomi appeared at the living room door. She looked pale, her eyes sunken and surrounded by heavy, dark circles that spoke of exhaustion and something much deeper. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. I started to rush toward her, wanting to pull her into my arms, but Ethan was faster. He stepped beside her, placing a hand on her waist in a way that looked protective, but felt entirely possessive. "Your mother came here to accuse me of forging your letters, sweetheart," he said softly. "She doesn't believe you are actually sick." Naomi looked at me, and her eyes filled with a heartbreaking mix of disappointment and bitterness. "Mom, how could you? I was hoping you would help us, even though I know you have always hated Ethan. But to come here and do this?" She couldn't even finish the sentence before the tears began to fall. Ethan leaned down and kissed her hair, a gesture that was supposed to be comforting, but I saw Naomi give a tiny, involuntary shiver. That was the moment I understood. He had built a perfect script where I was the villain, and he was the only one who truly cared for her. I stood there, completely alone in that expensive, silent hallway. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like crying. I looked Ethan straight in the eye and spoke every word with absolute clarity. "You can deceive her for now, but you cannot erase the trail of your lies. The truth always finds a way to the surface, and when it does, not a single wall or a single lie will be enough to save you." I turned around and walked away, the sound of the heavy door slamming shut behind me, feeling like a physical blow to my back. But as I stepped into the elevator, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. A new sense of confidence was beginning to take root in my chest. I had seen that momentary flash of fear in Ethan's eyes when I mentioned the handwriting. He was hiding something much bigger than $15,000. And I, Minnie, was not going to stop until I stripped away every layer of his mask. I took out my phone and called Ralph immediately. "Ralph, get ready," I said. "We aren't sending a single dime. We are going to find the proof." The sound of that heavy door slamming shut at apartment 402 echoed in my head long after I pulled out of the parking garage. As the city lights flickered to life, the red and blue neon signs smeared across the windshield of my Buick like strokes of messy paint. I drove home in a terrifying silence. No radio, not even a heavy sigh to break the quiet. That confrontation with Ethan had not left me afraid. It had done something much more powerful. It had woken me up. I kept seeing Naomi's dull, vacant eyes and the way she flinched when his hand touched her waist. That was not the exhaustion of a physical illness. It was the total depletion of a person who had been robbed of her very soul by the person she trusted most. When I finally walked through my front door, I found Ralph sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of old folders and his laptop open in front of him. He did not ask me how it went. He just looked into my eyes, seeing the redness and the newfound iron in them, and pushed a warm mug of chamomile tea toward me. "Minnie, I did some digging," Ralph said, his voice dropping into that low, heavy register. "Ethan is not just owing money to the casinos anymore. He is being sued for a series of ghost investments up in New Jersey. That $15,000 is not for a gallbladder surgery. It is the minimum payment he needs to make by the end of the month to keep himself out of a jail cell." I took a sip of the tea, the bitter herbal taste spreading through my throat. For 3 years, I had carried the weight of self-blame. I regretted being so hot-headed that Thanksgiving afternoon, fearing that my interference had only pushed her faster into his waiting arms. I had let years slip away in a hopeless wait, praying she would eventually see the truth on her own. But I see it clearly now. Naomi will never find her way out, as long as she is surrounded by a wall of lies so carefully built around her. I had been polite, I had been patient, and I had been silent. All of that just gave Ethan more time to isolate her. He had twisted my love into control, and his own deceit into protection in her eyes. A cold, sharp anger began to take shape in my chest, replacing the hollow ache that had lived there for so long. I was not the weak version of Minnie anymore, the one who cried by the mailbox and hoped for a scrap of attention. "Ralph!" I called out into the living room, my voice as crisp and cold as the winter air in the Blue Ridge Mountains. "We cannot wait another second. 3 years of these lies is more than enough. If she cannot walk out of that prison on her own, then I will be the one to dismantle it, brick by brick. We are going to start with the statements from the joint account she never closed at the local bank. I have a feeling Ethan has left a trail right there in our own backyard. We are going to find every transaction, every secret he thought he buried, and we are going to bring our daughter home." That night, sleep was a stranger to me. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind whistle through the narrow cracks of our old window frames, a sound that usually comforted me, but now felt like a low, haunting moan. The house itself seemed to be groaning, the wood creaking under the weight of the stories we had accumulated over the last 3 years. But for the first time in a long time, my heart did not feel like it was sinking into a pit of sighs. The bitterness I felt after being turned away by my own daughter in that cold, expensive hallway had transformed. It had hardened into something useful, a quiet and chilling strength that I had not felt since I was a young woman. I realized then that I could no longer sit in my kitchen, baking pies and pinning my hopes on a miracle that was never going to come. If Ethan had used a web of lies to pull us apart, then I was going to use the cold, hard truth to pull my daughter back home. As the first light of dawn began to touch the wild roses in the yard, still heavy with dew, Ralph and I were already at the kitchen table. We were ready for a journey we never imagined we would have to take at this stage of our lives. We drove to the First National Bank branch in the center of town just as the doors were opening. This was the place where Naomi had opened her very first savings account when she was only 16 years old. It was a joint account we had set up back then, and though it had been largely forgotten as she grew up and moved away, my name was still on it. Mr. Henderson, the bank manager and an old friend of Ralph's from the railroad days, greeted us with a look that was a mix of surprise and genuine concern. I placed that cream-colored envelope on his polished desk, my voice steadier than I ever expected it to be. "Henderson, we need to see the full transaction history for Naomi's joint account," I told him. "There are things happening that just do not add up." As the printer began its rhythmic, mechanical whirring, the sound seemed to sync up with my own heartbeat, faster and more insistent with every page that slid out. Henderson pushed the stack of papers across the desk, his eyes heavy behind his reading glasses. "Minnie, I actually thought about calling you last month," he admitted quietly. "But since it is a joint account, and most of the activity was happening through a mobile app, I did not think I had the legal standing to interfere." I looked down at the lines of black ink, and the truth began to scream off the page. There were small but regular withdrawals from ATMs, located right next to the major casinos in Atlantic City. There were payments to consulting firms with names I had never heard of, names that Ralph immediately recognized as common fronts for high-interest predatory lenders. The most painful discovery was a withdrawal of $5,000, cleaned out just 1 week ago. It matched perfectly with the timeline Ethan had created for the fake emergency surgery. He was not just lying to us to get our money. He was systematically draining the last bit of security my daughter had built for herself. When we got back home, Ralph stepped into a version of himself I had not seen in years. He was no longer just the retired man who tended to the garden. He was the engineer again, precise and methodical. He pulled out his old laptop, put on his glasses, and began researching every company name that had appeared on those bank statements. "Look at this, Minnie," he said, pointing to a screen filled with reports of investment scams and fraudulent schemes. "Ethan is not just a man with a gambling problem. He is a professional predator. He looks for women who are successful but isolated from their families, making them easier to control." Ralph used his analytical skills to map out a timeline, showing how every time Ethan blocked our calls or returned our letters, it coincided with a large sum of money being moved out of Naomi's account. It was not a coincidence. It was a calculated plan to make sure she had no one else to turn to but him. I decided it was time to reach out to the people Ethan thought he had silenced. I called Mrs. Higgins, the woman who had lived next door to Naomi before she moved into that high-rise with Ethan. Mrs. Higgins had always been a sharp woman who treated Naomi like her own granddaughter. Her voice was thin and shaky over the phone, as if she had been waiting for this call for a long time. "Oh, Minnie, I wanted to tell you so much," she whispered. "I saw him shouting at her in the parking lot. I saw her crying alone in the lobby more times than I can count. But every time I tried to ask if she was okay, she would tell me that everything was fine and that Ethan was just protecting her from people who wanted to control her life. He made her believe the whole world, including her own mother, was her enemy. Hearing those words felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. My daughter was not being stubborn. She was under the spell of a psychological poison disguised as protection. I began to gather everything we had found and placed it into a bright green folder, a color I chose because it felt like hope. The bank statements, the articles about Ethan's scams, the notes from my conversation with Mrs. Higgins, and the forged letter that Ralph had analyzed so carefully. Every single page I added made me feel a little more powerful. The feeling of being a helpless victim, the woman who stood by the mailbox for 3 years waiting for a sign, was completely gone. In its place was a cold, sharp clarity. I was no longer watching time slip away. I was in a race against it to save my daughter before Ethan took the very last thing she had left. Later that afternoon, I sat out on the porch with a cup of Earl Grey tea that had long since gone cold. For the first time in 3 years, the North Carolina sky looked perfectly clear to me, no longer blurred by the fog of my own regret or sorrow. Ralph walked out and placed a steady hand on my shoulder, his warmth giving me a sense of peace that I had almost forgotten existed. "We have enough now, Minnie," he said quietly, "but we have to stay calm. A man like Ethan will fight back hard if he feels backed into a corner." I looked up at him and offered a small, determined smile. "I know he will, Ralph, but he has forgotten one very important thing. He is up against an American mother, and there is nothing on this earth more dangerous than a mother who is finally going to get justice for her child." The feeling of being in control had finally returned, and I knew exactly where we had to go next. I sat there staring blankly at the green folder resting on the kitchen table. The stark, cold numbers on those bank statements and the scribbled notes about Ethan's mounting debts seemed to dance before my eyes, mocking my attempts to make sense of the chaos. Ralph had gone into the bedroom to lie down for a while because his blood pressure had spiked after a long and exhausting day at the bank. In the heavy silence of the house, I suddenly felt incredibly small. I wondered if an old woman like me really had what it took to stand up against someone as cunning and ruthless as Ethan. Could I actually bring my daughter back from the edge of the abyss he had created? Just as I was about to let out a long, defeated sigh, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a loud or urgent sound, just 2 gentle, rhythmic taps that felt strangely familiar. Standing on the porch was Sarah, Naomi's best friend from high school. I remembered Sarah so clearly, the girl with the sunny smile who used to spend hours in my kitchen baking donuts with Naomi every Christmas season. What for 3 long years, I had not seen even a shadow of her. Sarah stood there, holding a tray of freshly baked muffins, her eyes shimmering with a visible hesitation. She told me softly that she had heard I went to the city to look for Naomi the day before. I invited her inside and poured her a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea, watching as the warmth of the mug seemed to steady her hands. It turned out that Sarah had been shut out by Ethan in the exact same way I had. He had used malicious lies to drive a wedge between the 2 best friends, making Naomi believe that Sarah was jealous of her lifestyle and was actively trying to sabotage her happiness. Sarah set her teacup down, her voice trembling with emotion, as she told me she could no longer stay silent. She opened her phone and showed me some old messages from Naomi, messages filled with a deep sense of fear and confusion that my daughter had never dared to actually send. They were saved in her drafts, or sent to Sarah in those rare moments before Ethan had taken complete control of her phone and her life. Naomi had written that she felt like she was suffocating and that Ethan was monitoring every single cent she earned. But almost immediately after those cries for help, she would apologize and insist that Ethan was only doing it because he loved her and was worried about their future together. Hearing those words made my heart tighten in my chest. My daughter had been living in a beautiful gilded hell all this time. Sarah also gave me information about a local support group for women who were victims of psychological manipulation. She had been quietly researching and gathering this information for over a year, just waiting for the right moment to help her friend. Not long after Sarah left, Mr. Miller, the retired town sheriff, and Ralph's old fishing buddy, dropped by. He was carrying a bag of fresh apples from his orchard, but I knew his real purpose was to check in on the situation at the bank. News travels faster than the wind in a small town like ours. Mr. Miller sat down in the armchair and looked at my green folder with a gravity that made the room feel even quieter. He told us that we had done a remarkable job gathering those bank statements. He mentioned that he had an old colleague, now working as a consultant lawyer, in the city where Naomi lived, a man who specialized in cases of domestic financial fraud. He offered to connect us, promising that we would not let Ethan get away with using Naomi's hard-earned money to fund his gambling habits. Mr. Miller's help was more than just professional advice. It was a powerful affirmation, but we had an entire community standing firmly behind us. That evening, I felt a new kind of energy flowing through my veins. I no longer felt like a lonely old woman desperately searching for a lost child. I had Ralph, I had Sarah, I had Mr. Miller, and I had the quiet prayers of neighbors who were silently sending over warm dishes of food and kind thoughts. This warmth was a sharp contrast to the cold, sterile luxury of the apartment where Ethan was keeping Naomi isolated. I realized then that while Ethan could control Naomi's phone and her bank account, he could never control the deep bonds of family and the inherent kindness of a community. We were finally standing in the light, and that light was slowly beginning to dissolve the darkness he had worked so hard to build. I took Ralph's hand and looked into his eyes, telling him with a firm voice that we were going to bring our daughter home, and this time, we were not going to have to do it alone. Help comes when we least expect it. Sarah and Mr. Miller restored Minnie's faith, showing she doesn't have to struggle alone. Has a neighbor ever been a lifeline for you? Share your stories of kindness in the comments. Now, what harsh truths await Minnie? Let's find out together. 3 days followed the confrontation at that high-rise apartment, and during those 72 hours, our house felt like it was submerged under a thick, suffocating blanket of silence. Ralph spent most of his time hunched over the kitchen table, his reading glasses slipping down his nose as he cross-referenced every single line on those bank statements with the notes Sarah had given us. I, on the other hand, found myself tethered to the window in the living room. I sat in my favorite armchair, my eyes fixed on the long, winding road that leads from the city into our quiet corner of North Carolina. Sarah's words and the quiet support from Mr. Miller had given me a skeleton of the truth, a framework of what was happening. But I was still missing the soul of the story. I needed something that would fill in the gaps of Ethan's betrayal. I had already begun to mentally prepare myself for a long and exhausting legal battle, imagining months of lawyers and courtrooms. But I never could have guessed that the truth would find its own way home on a Tuesday afternoon, carried through a torrential downpour that turned our driveway into a river of red clay and gravel. The sound of tires crunching on the wet stones outside was hurried and uneven, lacking the steady rhythm of someone who was visiting for a friendly chat. I bolted upright, my heart jumping into my throat, as a strange car skidded to a stop right in front of our porch. The door flew open, and Naomi stepped out. She looked nothing like the polished, successful IT engineer I had seen just a few days ago. Her hair was a tangled mess, matted against her forehead by the driving rain, and her expensive wool coat was soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. But it was her eyes that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. They were swollen and red, filled with a depth of raw, unfiltered agony that I had never seen in her before. Ralph made it to the door just as she reached the top step, and the moment she crossed the threshold into the warmth of our hallway, her strength simply evaporated. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, her knees giving out. She didn't even cry at first. It was just a series of jagged, choked sobs that seemed to be pulled from the very bottom of her lungs. "Mom, Dad, I am so sorry," she gasped between breaths. "I was so wrong. I was so incredibly stupid." I dropped to the floor and pulled her into my arms, feeling the freezing rainwater from her clothes soak into my own skin. Even as the cold seeped into my bones, all I felt was a wave of fierce, protective love for my broken girl. Once we managed to get her into the kitchen and wrapped in a warm, dry blanket, Naomi reached into her bag with hands that would not stop shaking. She pulled out a thick pad of A4-lined paper, the kind students use for taking notes in college. She laid it out on the table under the yellow glow of the overhead light, and as Ralph and I leaned in to look, a wave of pure nausea washed over me. The pages were covered from top to bottom in handwriting. It was Naomi's handwriting, or at least it looked exactly like it. But she hadn't written a single word of it. "Dear Mom, I need help. $15,000. Gallbladder surgery. Please do not tell Dad." Sentence after sentence, the exact words from that cream-colored letter were copied hundreds of times. In the margins, there were chilling little notes written in Ethan's sharp, clinical script. The loop on the letter N needs to be rounder. Make the letter M softer here. This was not just a lie. This was a man who had spent hours, maybe even days, practicing how to impersonate his own wife like a professional counterfeiter. He had taken the very essence of my daughter's identity and turned it into a weapon to use against her own parents. He had studied her loops and her slants to perfect a script of deception, turning her love for us into a textbook for his fraud. Naomi began to speak in a voice that sounded hollow and exhausted, telling us what happened after I had left their apartment. She found hidden folders and encrypted emails that revealed a reality far worse than anything we had imagined. The debt wasn't $15,000. It was $37,000. Ethan had been using Naomi's name and her impeccable professional reputation to secure high-interest loans from predatory lenders to cover his losses at the baccarat tables. He had lied to her for years, telling her that Ralph and I were trying to seize control of her assets and that we were jealous of their success. He convinced her that the only way to protect their future was to give him total control over every account and every password. He had built a fortress of paranoia around her, making her believe that the two people who loved her most were actually her greatest enemies. The most painful part of her story came when she described the gaslighting he had put her through. "He told me you were losing your mind, Mom," she said, her voice cracking as fresh tears tracked through the dampness on her cheeks. "He told me you were becoming senile and that you wanted to destroy our marriage because you couldn't stand to see me happy with a man you didn't choose. Every time you called, he told me you were screaming at him, telling him that I needed to leave him and come back to live under your thumb. He deleted every single one of your messages before I could even see them." I sat there in stunned silence, feeling the weight of 3 years of missed connections. Every "I love you" I had sent into the void, every apology I had whispered into my phone at 2 in the morning, had been intercepted and twisted into a weapon of psychological warfare. The disgust I felt in that moment wasn't just anger. It was a profound, bone-deep contempt for a man who could look at his wife and see nothing but a target to be manipulated. Ralph reached out and picked up that pad of paper, his aged hands trembling with the fury he was struggling to contain. But his eyes were sharper than I had seen them in decades. "This is exactly what we need, Naomi," he said, his voice dropping into a low, steady rumble. "This is physical proof of forgery and financial fraud. Mr. Miller and that lawyer in the city will know exactly how to use this." I looked at my husband and my daughter, then down at the green folder that still sat on the counter. Every single piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. The 3 years of deafening silence, the suspicion, the cold way she had turned me away in that hallway. It all finally made sense. This truth was as sharp and painful as a knife wound, but it brought with it an absolute, undeniable clarity. We didn't have to guess anymore. We didn't have to live in the shadows of doubt. The predator had been unmasked, and my daughter had finally found her way back from the dark woods of his manipulation. Outside, the storm was finally starting to break, leaving behind the rich, heavy scent of damp earth and North Carolina pine needles. In our small kitchen, the three of us sat close together, the warmth of the room finally starting to reach Naomi's skin. For the first time in over 1,000 days, I didn't feel the distance of time or the heavy burden of regret. Ethan may have taken our money, and he may have stolen 3 years of Naomi's youth and our peace of mind. But he had failed at the one thing he tried hardest to do. He couldn't destroy the instinct that draws a child back to their roots when the world turns cold. I reached out and took Naomi's cold hand, rubbing it between my own calloused palms to bring the life back into it. "Everything is going to be all right now, honey," I told her. "We have the truth on our side, and the truth is finally going to set us all free." After Naomi had finally drifted off to sleep in her old bedroom, the room I had kept frozen in time for over 1,000 days of waiting, I stepped quietly out onto the back porch. The storm had fully passed, leaving behind nothing but the rhythmic, soft dripping of water from the eaves onto the wild rose bushes below. Ralph had fallen asleep in his armchair, his hand still resting protectively on the green folder. In the sudden stillness of the house, I felt strangely weightless, a hollow but peaceful relief that only comes after the worst of the truth has been weathered. I found myself climbing the narrow stairs to the attic, seeking out the dusty cedar chest my mother had left me. In that old wood, there was a sanctuary I always returned to when I felt truly lost. I pulled out the old quilt, its heavy fabric smelling of cedar and forgotten winters. It was a patchwork of hundreds of scraps, stitched together by my mother's hands during the lean, hard years of the Great Depression. Every piece of fabric told a story. A scrap from my father's old work shirt, a bit of my aunt's wedding dress, a square from a frayed Sunday tablecloth. My mother used to tell me, "Minnie, life is exactly like this quilt. It can be torn, it can get stained, and sometimes it looks like a mess of rags. But if you know how to stitch the pieces back together with enough patience and love, it will still keep the whole family warm through the coldest winters." As I traced my fingers over those rough, steady stitches, I realized I had spent too much time mourning the tears of the last 3 years. I had forgotten that I was the one who held the needle. I was the one responsible for mending the heart of this family. I sat there in the dim light, thinking of my father. He was a gentle Southern man with a will made of Blue Ridge steel. He always taught me that family wasn't a place for judgment, but a place for shelter. I could almost see us back in the rose garden on those long summer afternoons. He used to say, "Roses are beautiful, Minnie, but they have thorns to protect themselves. People are the same way. Sometimes they grow prickles and lash out not because they hate you, but because they are terrified." Those words felt like a soothing balm on my wounded heart. I wasn't angry at Naomi anymore for turning me away or for the things she said under Ethan's shadow. I only felt a deep, aching sorrow that she had been forced to face that darkness alone for so long. The strength of those who came before me seemed to surge through my veins, reminding me that I wasn't just fighting for the present, but for the honor and the peace of our entire bloodline. I stood up and wrapped the heavy quilt around my shoulders, feeling the weight of history and the warmth of time. A profound peace settled over me, not the peace of someone who has given up, but the stillness of a deep mountain lake before the first ripple of a new day. I looked toward the horizon, where the very first blush of dawn was beginning to stir. I wasn't afraid of Ethan anymore, nor of the intricate web of lies he had spun. I am my mother's daughter. I am Naomi's mother, and I am the keeper of this home. Tomorrow, we will stand up together, not fueled by hatred, but by the immovable strength of a love that has been tempered in the fire. My resolve was now as deep and unyielding as the roots of the ancient oak tree standing guard in our front yard. The first light of dawn was just beginning to touch the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gold. I was still sitting on the porch, the heavy weight of my mother's old quilt wrapped around my shoulders like a suit of armor made of memories. Inside the house, Naomi was finally sleeping in her old bed, her breathing deep and even for the first time in over 1,000 days. But that fragile peace was shattered in an instant by the violent, high-pitched screech of tires against the red clay and gravel of our driveway. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The darkness had followed us all the way from the city, determined to reclaim its prize. I took one long, steady breath, felt the strength of the generation stitched into the fabric on my shoulders, and then I stood up. I set the quilt aside, smoothing out my clothes. The time for hiding was over. It was time to stand my ground. Ethan stepped out of his sleek black car, looking perfectly out of place in our quiet woods. He was wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than our Buick, looking like he was prepared for a high-stakes meeting on Wall Street. He didn't bother to knock. Instead, he pounded his fist against our wooden front door with a force that sounded like a gunshot in the morning silence. He started shouting, his voice echoing off the trees. He claimed that Ralph and I were committing a crime, that we were guilty of unauthorized detention of his wife. When I finally opened the door, he pushed his way inside, bringing with him a thick cloud of expensive artificial cologne that seemed to choke the air out of our cozy living room. He looked around with a sneer of pure contempt, his eyes finally landing on me with a cold, predatory glare. He started telling me that I was destroying my daughter's marriage out of senile selfishness. He said Naomi was sick and needed to be cared for by her legal husband, not kept in some backwoods shack. Naomi appeared in the hallway then, her body visibly trembling at the sight of him. The moment he saw her, Ethan's face transformed. It was a terrifying sight to behold. In a split second, his rage vanished, replaced by a look of deep, heartbreaking sorrow that belonged on an award-winning actor. He started calling to her in a low, soothing voice, telling her that I had forced her to write those things and that I wanted them to divorce so I could seize her assets. He told her he had already made an appointment with the best psychiatrist in the city for her. He stepped toward her, reaching out a hand as if to pull her back into his shadow. But Naomi didn't move toward him. She stepped back, hiding herself behind my shoulder. Ethan let out a roar then, completely abandoning his polite facade. He screamed that if I didn't let her go, he would call the police. He shouted that he had legal power of attorney over every decision she made, and that I had no right to interfere in his family. That was when Ralph walked into the room, his face set in a mask of absolute calm. He was carrying the green folder, and he placed it squarely on the old wooden table in the center of the room. He told Ethan that since he wanted to talk about the law, they should speak in the language of the law. Ralph opened the first page, pointing to the bank statements we had marked in red ink. He laid out the $37,000 in gambling debts that Ethan had taken out in Naomi's name. Then, he pulled out the pad of paper where Ethan had practiced forging her signature, just to steal $5,000 from our joint savings. Ethan froze for a moment, his pupils shrinking as he stared at the evidence of his own crimes. He tried to laugh it off, calling the papers garbage and telling us we were too old and confused to understand what we were looking at. I took a step forward then, looking him directly in his cold, dark eyes. Every ounce of fear I had ever felt for this man had vanished, replaced by a deep and chilling contempt. I told him that he might have been able to trick our daughter with his version of love, but he couldn't trick the numbers or our clarity of mind. I reminded him about Mr. Miller, the man he had tried to intimidate years ago. I told him that Mr. Miller had already filed a report with the district attorney's office this morning regarding financial fraud and identity theft. Then, I handed him a single sheet of paper I had printed earlier. It was an emergency protective order that Naomi had signed the night before at a lawyer's office in town. I told him that from this moment on, he was legally barred from coming within 100 yards of her. I made it very clear that if he took even one more step toward her, I would be the one calling the police to have him hauled off to jail for violating a court order. Ethan grabbed the paper from my hand, his face turning from a bright, angry red to a sickly pale gray. He looked at Naomi, desperate to find one last spark of weakness he could exploit. But my daughter met his gaze with the steady resolve I had been praying for. She told him that I was right and that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She told him he had spent her time and her money at his gambling tables, but he would never, ever have her soul again. He stood there for a long time, looking small and pathetic in the middle of our sun-drenched living room. For the first time, I saw him shake. It wasn't out of grief or love, but because the truth had finally stripped away the mask of power he had worked so hard to build. He threw the paper onto the floor and stormed out, his tires screaming once more as he sped away. The sound faded into the distance until there was nothing left but the sound of birds singing in the rose garden. I turned around and pulled Naomi and Ralph into my arms. We had won the battle, not with violence, but with the immovable strength of the truth and our unity as a family. What a breathtaking moment! Seeing Minnie stand her ground with that protective order felt like a weight lifted. Ethan used threats, but Minnie used the truth to win. Have you ever faced a gaslighter who made you feel confused? Share your story below. It could help someone else. Like if you're proud of Minnie's strength. The sound of Ethan's engine faded into the distance at the end of the long road, leaving behind a silence that felt remarkably heavy, yet strangely clean. The three of us stood there in the living room as the morning sun poured through the windows, the lingering warmth of my mother's quilt still touching my skin like a silent promise from the past. That confrontation wasn't the end of our story. It was the starting gun for a long journey to reclaim everything that had been stolen from us. Ralph placed his thin, weathered hand on Naomi's shoulder, his voice sounding warm, but carrying a weight of authority I hadn't heard in years. He told her it was time to start clearing away the wreckage, and that we were going to do this the right way, one careful step at a time. The following morning, we found ourselves sitting in the office of a man named Andrew, the lawyer Mr. Miller had recommended to us. His office was tucked inside a beautiful old red brick building in the center of town, a place that smelled of fresh paper and polished oak. Andrew was the quintessential American professional, calm, steady, and incredibly attentive to the smallest details. When he looked through my green folder and saw the pages where Ethan had practiced Naomi's handwriting, he gave a slow, appreciative nod. He told me that I had done an incredible job with the investigation. He explained that this evidence would not only make Naomi's divorce a straightforward process, but would provide more than enough grounds for the district attorney to pursue charges for financial fraud and forgery. Naomi sat right beside me, and for the first time in 3 long years, I noticed she wasn't looking at the floor. She looked Andrew straight in the eye, listening intently as he advised her on how to close their joint accounts and place a freeze on any loans taken out in her name. The journey toward justice wasn't just about what happened in a courtroom. It was about the small, practical victories we won every single day. I spent the afternoon driving Naomi to various service centers to change her phone number and reset every single password for her social media and email accounts. We sat together in the corner of a local Starbucks, the air filled with the scent of roasted beans and the quiet chatter of our neighbors. I watched her as she logged into her digital world, a place where she had been a prisoner for so long. The moment she finally hit the button to log out of all devices, effectively cutting the invisible strings Ethan had used to track her, she let out a long, shaky breath. She looked at me with a small, genuine smile and said she felt like she was finally able to breathe again after being held underwater for years. It was a simple moment, but it felt like the heaviest chain of all had finally snapped. As for Ethan, the gears of justice began to turn in their own cold and certain way. With the evidence from the bank and the testimony from our friend Mr. Henderson, the district attorney's office officially summoned him for questioning regarding the fraudulent activity and the forged documents. He tried to call several times, oscillating between desperate pleas for forgiveness and hollow threats of legal retaliation. However, the emergency protective order we had secured made it impossible for him to get anywhere near our family without facing immediate arrest. The gambling debts he had tried so hard to pin on Naomi were being meticulously separated by financial experts who could see the pattern of his deceit. The truth about a financial predator was finally being laid bare for everyone to see. There was no need for us to seek revenge with angry words or violence. The quiet and steady application of the law was making him look small and pathetic, all on its own. That evening, Ralph fired up the grill in the backyard, the rich and smoky scent of steaks wafting through the peaceful air. We sat together at the old wooden table under the canopy of our massive oak tree, the same tree that had watched Naomi grow up. She reached into her bag and pulled out a new folder, but this one wasn't about the past. It was an application for a senior position at a major tech firm right here in North Carolina. She had decided that she wasn't going back to that city or that high-rise life. She told us she wanted to start over right here, close to the people who had never stopped fighting for her. I looked at my daughter and saw the reflection of the stubborn, talented woman she had always been. We hadn't just found justice on the papers in a lawyer's office. We had found a new kind of freedom right here in our own home. The time we lost can never be replaced, but as the sun set over the trees, the future looked wider and brighter than it had in a very long time. After that quiet steak dinner in the backyard, a profound stillness settled over our house. It was not the cold, suffocating silence of the past 3 years that used to make the walls feel like they were closing in on me. This was different. It was the deep, restorative quiet of an army resting before the final day. I lay in my bed that night, watching the familiar patterns of the streetlights as they filtered through the blinds and danced across the ceiling. I knew that when the sun rose again, the long shadow Ethan had cast over our lives would finally be shortened. No more fake letters written in a practiced hand. No more sugary lies designed to rot our family from the inside. And no more running away from the truth. I reached out in the darkness and found Ralph's hand, feeling the steady, familiar strength of his grip. We had traveled such a long and weary road to get back to this moment, and now it was time to let the law finish the work we had started with our own hands. The morning of the hearing, the North Carolina sky was a brilliant, endless blue, without a single cloud to mar its clarity. The county courthouse sat right in the heart of town, a majestic white stone building that carried the weight of 100 years of history. I chose my best navy blue dress, the one I usually save for the most important Sunday services, and Naomi walked between Ralph and me as we approached the steps. She looked so small against the backdrop of that massive building, but her footsteps were firm and steady on the stone. As we pushed through the heavy wooden doors and entered the district attorney's office, I felt a sudden rush of cool, sterile air. There was a solemnity in that room that demanded respect. It was not a place for impulsive outbursts or heated arguments. It was a place where facts reigned supreme and where the truth was the only currency that mattered. Ethan was already there, sitting at a long table with his lawyer. He wasn't wearing his designer suit this time. Instead, he was in a simple wrinkled shirt, and the polished, arrogant facade he usually wore like armor had completely crumbled. His face looked gaunt and hollowed out, and his eyes flitted nervously around the room, unable to settle on any one thing for more than a second. When we walked in, he opened his mouth as if he were about to launch into another one of his practiced speeches, but a sharp warning look from Andrew made him fall silent instantly. The district attorney, a woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's, began to read through the evidence we had meticulously gathered. She spoke of the bank statements from Atlantic City, the clear testimony from Mr. Henderson, and then she held up the practice pad. It was the most damning evidence of all. Each word she read felt like another brick being piled onto Ethan's shoulders. He tried to mutter something about how it was all an investment for their future, but when Andrew presented the official records of the $37,000 debt, every excuse he had left became laughable. Then it was Naomi's turn to speak. I held my breath so tightly, my chest began to ache, my hands gripping the arms of my chair until my knuckles were white. She stood up, her voice trembling slightly at first, before it found a strength that made me swell with pride. She didn't speak of hatred or revenge. She spoke of the 3 years she spent in a gilded cage, cut off from the people who loved her. She told the room about the times she had been desperate to call me, only to be convinced by Ethan that I had washed my hands of her. She described the moment she realized, but the man she had trusted with her heart was the same man who was systematically bleeding her parents' life savings dry. I am not standing here because I want to hurt anyone, Naomi said, looking Ethan directly in the eye for the first time. I am here to reclaim my name and the truth that you stole from my family. You used my life like a gambling debt, and now it is time for you to pay that debt with your own freedom. Ethan slumped forward, his head dropping to the table. He couldn't look at her. The truth had finally stripped him of every ounce of power he thought he had. After 2 hours of intense, focused discussion, the district attorney reached her conclusion. Ethan would face formal charges for fraud and forgery, and he would be legally obligated to repay every cent he had taken from Naomi's accounts, as well as the $5,000 he had tried to swindle from us. But the most important victory came when the request for an immediate, no-fault divorce was granted, backed by the overwhelming evidence of financial and psychological abuse. Naomi's assets were legally separated once and for all, and a permanent injunction was issued, barring Ethan from ever contacting any member of our family again. When the gavel finally struck the wood at the end of the preliminary hearing, I felt a massive, invisible weight lift off my chest. Justice hadn't just reclaimed our money. It had reclaimed the honor of the family I had spent my life building. We stepped back out into the light of the midday sun, which felt as warm and sweet as honey against our faces. I stopped for a moment on the courthouse steps, closing my eyes and inhaling a deep, full breath of the fresh air. I looked over at Naomi and saw her smiling. It was a real smile, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes and erased the shadows that had lived there for so long. Ralph took my hand, and that we had finally brought our girl home for good. As I looked down the road toward our old house, I realized that the last 3 years hadn't been a total waste of time. They had taught me the true meaning of patience. They had taught Naomi the absolute value of her own independence. And they had shown our entire family that no darkness is thick enough to hide the truth if you are brave enough to go searching for it. The regret I had carried for so long simply dissolved, replaced by a deep and profound appreciation for the present moment. On the drive back, we stopped at that old familiar diner at the edge of town. We sat in a booth, eating burgers and drinking milkshakes, and talking about the future like any other normal family. I realized then that I didn't feel any more pain when I thought about Ethan. He had become nothing more than a faint, fading low note in the music of my life. The greatest liberation wasn't seeing him punished. It was the moment we realized his presence could no longer touch our happiness. I had finally found my own identity again. I wasn't a lonely, abandoned woman waiting by a mailbox. I was a resilient mother who had successfully defended her home and her child. From this day forward, our time belongs to us again. It is a brand new chapter, filled with hope, laughter, and a peace that I know will last us the rest of our lives. 6 months have passed since that fateful morning at the county courthouse. Autumn has officially arrived in the mountains of North Carolina, dressing the maple forests in brilliant shades of red and gold. In my small kitchen, the warm scent of baking apple pie has begun to fill the air once again. But this time, it doesn't carry the bitter aftertaste of a lonely wait. I find myself standing by the window, watching Naomi and Ralph as they work together to tend the rose garden out front. She has cut away the long, sorrowful hair she wore for years, replacing it with a short, vibrant style that reflects the energy she has found again. She recently started a new job as a software consultant for a local hospital, finally free from the soul-crushing pressures of the city. Ethan is now nothing more than a fading shadow in our past, held accountable by the law for the wreckage he tried to leave behind. What matters most to me is that the spark of trust has finally returned to my daughter's eyes. This morning, I found a small envelope sitting on the coffee table. It wasn't that fake cream color from before, just a simple piece of notepad paper with Naomi's slightly messy but heartfelt handwriting. It said, "Mom, I'm heading out to work. I will pick up some ribs for dinner tonight so we can watch Dad's favorite movie together. I love you, and thank you for never giving up on me." I pressed that note to my chest, feeling the steady and peaceful beat of my own heart. 3 years of silence taught me that while time can be stolen, the bond of family can never be destroyed if you are brave enough to hold on to it. I no longer look back with regret, because the storms we weathered only helped us realize the true value of the truth and the simple joy of being together. My dear friends, the story of Minnie and Naomi comes to a close here, but I believe it has planted a seed of hope in all of our hearts. Sometimes we let time slip away in a fog of misunderstanding and regret, allowing strangers to use manipulation to tear apart those we love most. But as Minnie has proven, if we do not give up, and if we dare to look directly at the truth, it is never too late to bring our loved ones back home. I am deeply moved by Minnie's resilience. She didn't just save her daughter from a predator. She saved herself from the abyss of loneliness. The greatest lesson here is to never underestimate the instinct and love of a mother, and to never let lies take root in the heart of a family. How do you feel after listening to this entire journey? Is there a detail that resonated with you the most, or a lesson you have taken away for yourself? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, as I would be so happy to read them and chat with you. Goodbye for now, and I wish you a peaceful day surrounded by those you love. I am Casey, and I look forward to seeing you in our next story.